I was sitting on my couch, same spot I sit every single evening after a long day, show playing, volume up, completely zoned out, and my son walked in, looked at the TV, looked at me and just turned it off. Didn't ask. Didn't warn me. Just walked straight up to it and hit the button. And before I could even open my mouth, he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Mom, enough of this trash." I didn't say anything. I just sat there. Because in that moment I didn't know if I was angry, embarrassed, or somewhere deep down scared. Scared because the way he said it wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a moody teenager moment. It was calm, deliberate, like he'd been holding that in for a while and had finally just decided today was the day. And I remember sitting in that silence thinking, when did my kid start seeing me like this? How long had he been watching me come home, sit down, and just disappear into a screen every night? Because that's what hit me hardest. It wasn't the words. It was the fact that he noticed. That he'd been noticing. And that it took a 13-year-old boy to finally say what apparently nobody else in my life had the guts to say to me. What happened after that, the conversation, the argument, the things that came out that I wasn't ready to hear, changed something between us permanently. And honestly, changed something in me too. I've been a mother for 13 years. 13 years of packed lunches and parent evenings and staying up past midnight Googling symptoms because he sneezed twice and I'd already convinced myself it was something serious. 13 years of knowing this child. His moods, his tells, the specific way his face shifts when he's lying about homework versus when he's genuinely upset about something. I knew this kid. Or at least that's what I'd been telling myself right up until the moment I was sitting alone in a dark living room realizing I maybe didn't know him as well as I thought. Because the boy who had just walked into that kitchen wasn't behaving like any version of my son I recognized. And that's what kept nagging at me as I sat there. Not the words themselves. I'd already turned those over enough times in the last 5 minutes. What I couldn't shake was the delivery, the composure. The fact that he hadn't shouted it or sulked it or thrown it at me in the middle of an argument the way teenagers say things they don't fully mean. He'd said it the way an adult says something they've thought about carefully, measured, intentional, and then walked away without waiting for a reaction. That last part is what unsettled me the most. He didn't want to fight. He wasn't looking for a response. He'd said his piece and considered the matter handled. When did that happen? When did my son go from the kid who used to drag his blanket to the sofa and fall asleep against my shoulder during films he begged to stay up and watch, to someone who could walk into a room, assess it, make a decision, and execute it with that kind of quiet confidence? I wasn't even angry anymore by this point. I was something more complicated than angry. I was sitting there feeling genuinely caught off guard by my own child. And there's a specific kind of vulnerability in that moment that I don't think gets talked about enough. The moment you realize your child has been growing into a person while you were busy just trying to get through the week. And here's what started creeping in right after that: pride. Which completely blindsided me because it was the last thing I expected to feel. But it was there, sitting right alongside the discomfort, refusing to be ignored. Because some part of me, underneath everything, recognized that what he had just done took guts. Walking up to a parent and saying that, calmly, directly, without aggression, that's not nothing. That's a kid who has developed a spine and the self-awareness to use it without throwing a grenade while he does it. I had spent years trying to raise exactly that kind of person. And now that he'd shown up, I wasn't sure how to feel about the fact that he'd aimed it at me first. But pride has a short shelf life when fear is sitting in the same room. And the fear came back quickly. Because if he was that composed, that deliberate, that certain, then this hadn't been a spontaneous reaction. This had been a decision. Which meant there was a thought process behind it. Which meant there were thoughts I hadn't been privy to. Which meant my son had an entire interior world of observations and conclusions about our home. About me, about what he saw every evening when he walked through that front door. And I had no idea what was in it. How long had he been watching me settle into that sofa and disappear? How many evenings had he walked past me without saying anything, carrying whatever he was carrying, while I was 2 seasons deep into something I'd already half forgotten? And more than that, what had he decided about me because of it? I needed to go into that kitchen. But I needed 1 more minute. Because I was starting to understand that whatever conversation was about to happen, I couldn't walk into it thinking I already knew how it would go. Because the version of me he was about to describe was someone I barely recognized. Here's something I hadn't let myself think about yet. In all the minutes that had passed since that screen went black, since those words hit the air between us, since I'd sat alone pulling apart his expression and his composure and what it all meant, I hadn't once stopped to think about what was actually playing on that TV when he walked in. And the moment it occurred to me to think about it, I wished it hadn't. Because that's when the embarrassment came back. Not the mild surface-level kind from earlier. The deeper kind. The kind that starts in your chest and works its way up slowly. It wasn't the news. It wasn't a documentary. It wasn't even something I could dress up as mindless but harmless background noise. It was the third episode of a reality show I had already watched twice before. A show where people screamed at each other across dinner tables about things that didn't matter. Where every conversation was engineered for maximum drama. Where nobody listened to anyone and the loudest person in the room was always treated like the most important one. I knew every storyline. I knew how every argument ended. I had seen this episode specifically at least twice, and I had still chosen to put it on again that evening because it required absolutely nothing from me. No attention. No emotional investment. No thinking. Just noise that filled the room so I didn't have to sit in the quiet. And my 13-year-old son had walked in, taken one look at the screen, taken one look at me, and made a decision. In that moment, standing in my empty living room with the television off and the quiet pressing in around me, I had to ask myself something I really did not want to ask. Was he wrong? Because here I was, a grown woman, voluntarily spending her evenings rewatching arguments between strangers about nothing. Not because she enjoyed it exactly. Not because it made her feel good or taught her anything or added something to her life. But because it was easier than the alternative. Easier than sitting in silence. Easier than thinking. Easier than being present in her own home in a way that might actually require something of her. That word kept snagging on something. Trash. I had flinched at it when he said it, the way you flinch at something that lands too close to a truth you've been sidestepping. Because the honest answer, the one I was only able to admit to myself in that specific moment of forced stillness, was that I had known for a while that what I was watching wasn't doing anything for me. I had known, and I had kept watching anyway. There's a particular kind of willful blindness that comes with habits you've stopped examining, and I had been living inside one of mine so comfortably that it took someone else pointing at it before I could even see it clearly. But here's the thing that twisted the knife a little further. It wasn't just what was on the screen. It was what wasn't happening because of it. While I was on that sofa, checked out and unavailable, my son was somewhere else in the house, doing homework alone. Eating whatever he'd managed to sort out for himself. Moving through his own evening in a home where his mother was technically present but functionally somewhere else entirely. And he was 13. Which means he was old enough to notice the difference between a parent who was there and a parent who was just in the building. I had told myself for months that I deserved to switch off in the evenings. That I'd earned it. That everyone needs downtime and this was mine. And none of that was entirely untrue. But somewhere along the way, downtime had quietly turned into disappearing. And the show on the television hadn't caused that. It had just been the most visible symptom of it. The thing my son could point at because it was right there on the screen, impossible to argue with, impossible to reframe as anything other than exactly what it was. He hadn't just switched off the TV. He had switched off my excuse. And now I had to walk into that kitchen with nothing left to hide behind. I want to take you back to those 4 words for a moment. Not because I haven't already turned them over a dozen times, but because the more I sat with them, the more I realized I'd been hearing them wrong. My first instinct, that initial gut reaction when they came out of his mouth, was to receive them as a criticism of the show. Trash, as in what you're watching is low quality, beneath you, a waste of time. And on the surface that's exactly what it sounded like. But somewhere between sitting alone in that living room and finally pushing myself up off that sofa, I started to understand that what he actually said was something much larger than a comment about television programming. Those 4 words were a verdict. And the thing being judged wasn't the show. It was the pattern. The whole accumulated weight of every evening I had spent in that exact spot, in that exact posture, unavailable and unreachable, choosing noise over presence. He hadn't said, "That show is trash." He'd said, "Enough of this. The whole thing. The routine. The disappearing act I had dressed up as self-care and repeated so consistently that my 13-year-old son now associated it with something he needed to put a stop to. Enough. As in, I have reached my limit. As in, this has been going on long enough that I feel entitled to intervene." That's not a passing comment. That's a boundary. My child had drawn a boundary with me, and I didn't even know he'd been building up to it. I stood up from that sofa slowly. The kind of slowly that has nothing to do with your body and everything to do with your mind catching up with what it's just understood. And I walked toward the kitchen doorway, and I stopped there for a second before going in, because I needed to decide something. I needed to decide what kind of mother I was going to be in the next 5 minutes. Was I going to walk in there and defend myself, redirect the conversation, remind him that adults need downtime and he was out of line? Because that option was available to me. It would have been easy. It would have ended the discomfort quickly. Or was I going to walk in there and actually listen, not perform listening, not wait for my turn to explain myself, but genuinely hear whatever he had decided it was finally time to say? And the reason that choice was harder than it sounds is because listening, truly listening, meant accepting that whatever came next might be difficult to hear. It meant making myself vulnerable to the honest observations of someone who had been watching me more closely than I realized. There's a reason we avoid those conversations. There's a reason it's easier to get defensive or deflect, or turn it around into a discussion about manners and respect. Because staying open costs something. And I was already feeling raw enough that I wasn't sure I had much left to spend. But I thought about his face again. That composure. That measured, deliberate certainty. And I realized that a child who approaches a moment like that with that much care deserves a parent who meets it with equal care. He hadn't been cruel. He hadn't been disrespectful in the way that word usually gets used. He had been honest. Uncomfortably, unexpectedly, piercingly honest. And if I shut that down with defensiveness, I wouldn't just be avoiding a hard conversation. I'd be teaching him that honesty aimed at the wrong person gets punished. That speaking up only works when it's convenient for the person on the receiving end. I wasn't willing to teach him that. Not after everything I had spent 13 years trying to build in him. So I straightened up, took a breath, and walked into the kitchen. What I found in there was not what I was expecting. Not even close. He was standing at the counter eating cereal. Not a proper dinner. Cereal. At 7:30 in the evening. And I stood there in the doorway of my own kitchen watching my son eat cornflakes for dinner. And I felt something land in my stomach that I can only describe as a slow, heavy thud. Because this wasn't a one-off. That was the part one couldn't talk myself out of in that moment. The cereal wasn't the crisis. The cereal was the evidence. Evidence that somewhere along the line, the evening routine in our house had quietly reorganized itself around my absence from it. He hadn't come to tell me he was hungry. He hadn't knocked on any metaphorical door and asked for anything. He just handled it. Independently. Silently. The way you do when you've learned not to expect something from a particular direction. He looked up when I walked in. Didn't say anything straight away. Just looked at me with that same steadiness from earlier, spoon halfway to his mouth, waiting to see what version of this conversation I decided to bring in with me. And I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. No speech prepared. No argument loaded. Just me, sitting across from my kid, finally in the same room and actually present in it for the first time in longer than I wanted to calculate. I asked him how long. Not dramatically. Just quietly. How long had he felt like this? And he put his spoon down, which told me he'd been waiting for that question, maybe hoping for it because he didn't hesitate. He said, "A while, Mom. A while." And the way he said it, not accusatory, not performing hurt for effect, just plainly and factually, made it worse somehow than if he'd shouted it. Because plain and factual meant it had moved past the stage of being something that upset him. It had just become something he'd accepted. And a child who has accepted being low on the priority list without complaint is not a child who feels fine about it. That's a child who has stopped expecting things to be different. I want to tell you what that did to me, but I'm not sure I have the right words for it even now. Because in that moment every memory I had of the last year started rearranging itself. All the evenings I thought he was fine because he hadn't said anything. All the weekends I thought we were okay because there hadn't been any arguments. I had been measuring our relationship by the absence of conflict, by the fact that he never kicked up a fuss, never demanded attention, never made it difficult. And I had called that easy. I had privately congratulated myself on raising a child who was so independent, so low maintenance, so capable of entertaining himself, when what I was actually looking at was a child who had learned to be those things out of necessity rather than nature. That distinction cracked something open in me that I wasn't prepared for, because I had a story I told myself about the kind of mother I was. Not perfect, I never claimed perfect, but present, caring, trying. I held on to that story tightly because it was the scaffolding a lot of my self-worth was built on. And sitting across from my son in that kitchen, watching him eat cereal for dinner on a Tuesday night, I could feel that scaffolding starting to shift under its own weight. I thought about my own childhood then. The things I had promised myself I would do differently. The specific feelings I had sworn my children would never feel inside their own home. And the question that followed that thought was one I would have done anything to avoid asking myself. Had I kept those promises? Not in theory. Not in intention. In practice. In the daily unglamorous showing up reality of it. Had I actually kept them? The answer was sitting across from me eating cornflakes. And it wasn't saying a word. But it was about to. He pushed the bowl to one side. That small, deliberate movement told me everything about what was coming next. This wasn't going to be a shrug and a "it's fine, Mom, forget it." He had something to say and he had decided, in whatever internal calculation 13-year-olds make in these moments, that tonight was the night he was going to say it. And I want to be honest with you, part of me wanted to stop him before he started. Not because I didn't care, but because there is a specific kind of dread that comes with knowing you are about to hear something true that you cannot unhear. Once it's out, it lives in the room permanently. You can't unknow it. You can't go back to the comfortable version of events you've been operating inside. And I had been operating inside a comfortable version for quite some time. But I didn't stop him. I kept my hands flat on the table, kept my face as open as I could manage, and I let him talk. And what came out over the next few minutes reordered everything I thought I understood about what had been happening in our home. He didn't start with that evening. He didn't start with the TV or the show or the words he'd said in the living room 20 minutes ago. He started 6 months back. Which meant he'd been carrying this for 6 months. 6 months of watching, noticing, filing things away, and saying absolutely nothing. And I hadn't noticed any of it. Not a single signal. Which, as he kept talking, I began to understand was partly because I hadn't been looking. He told me about a Tuesday in October. He'd had a terrible day at school. The kind of day that at 13 feels unsurvivable even if it's survivable, and he'd come home wanting to talk about it. He'd stood in the living room doorway, he said. He'd stood there for a few minutes. And I had been on the sofa, eyes on the screen, and I had said twice, and that's annoying. Once without ever actually turning to look at him. He hadn't pushed it. He'd gone to his room. And he said that was the evening he stopped bringing things home to me. Just like that. One evening. One moment of feeling invisible in his own house, and he had quietly, privately, closed a door I didn't even know he'd been holding open for me. I heard that and I had to work very hard to stay present in my body because every instinct I had was to either defend myself or completely fall apart. And neither of those responses would have served him in that moment. So I stayed. I listened. And he kept going. He told me about the school project he'd wanted help with that I'd agreed to look at and then forgot about entirely. He told me about the weekend he'd asked if we could do something together, and I'd said maybe next weekend 3 weekends in a row until he stopped asking. He wasn't listing these things vindicatively. He wasn't building a case against me with the energy of someone who wanted to win an argument. He was just telling me what had happened. Factually. Carefully. The way someone speaks when they've rehearsed something not out of performance but out of self-protection. And here's what hit hardest. He said he hadn't told me any of this because he didn't want me to feel bad. My 13-year-old son had been sitting on 6 months of hurt specifically to protect my feelings. He had absorbed it, managed it, tucked it away somewhere private so that I wouldn't have to be uncomfortable. And instead of that making me feel relieved or loved or grateful, it made me feel the full weight of what I had been asking of him without ever asking at all. I had created a home where my child felt responsible for managing my emotional comfort, where speaking up felt like a burden he wasn't sure I could handle. That wasn't the mother I had promised myself I would be, and we both knew it. But what he said next, I genuinely did not see it coming. He told me he'd been talking to his teacher about it. Not a counselor, not a friend, his form tutor, a woman I had met twice at parents' evening, exchanged pleasantries with, thanked for looking after him, and who had apparently been having regular conversations with my son about what was happening at home for the better part of 2 months. And I want to be clear about the sequence of emotions that moved through me when he said that, because they came fast and they came in a specific order that I think is important. First there was shock. Then there was something that felt uncomfortably close to humiliation. And then, before I could get anywhere near anything more rational, there was anger. Not at him. Or at least that's what I told myself in the moment. But anger has a way of finding the nearest available target when it doesn't know where else to go. I asked him why. Why her? Why hadn't he come to me? And I heard myself asking it, and I knew, even as the words were leaving my mouth, that it was the wrong question. That the answer was sitting in everything he'd already told me in the last 10 minutes. But knowing something is the wrong question and stopping yourself from asking it anyway are two very different things when you're sitting across from your child feeling simultaneously guilty and defensive and caught completely off guard. He looked at me steadily and he said, "Because I didn't think you'd actually listen, Mom." And that was the sentence that broke the surface of everything. Because that's when it stopped being a calm conversation. Not because he raised his voice, he didn't. But because I did. Not loudly. Not in the way that fills a room and frightens people. But my voice changed. It took on that tight, controlled quality that is somehow worse than shouting because everyone in earshot knows exactly what it's containing. I told him that wasn't fair. That I was always here. That he could always come to me with anything, and he knew that. And I meant every word of it. I genuinely, completely meant it. Which is exactly what made his response so difficult to absorb. He said, "You're always here, but you're not always present." And he said it quietly, without cruelty, like he'd thought about the difference between those two things and wanted to make sure I understood he had. And I opened my mouth to respond and nothing came out. Because what do you say to that? What argument do you construct against something that precise, delivered by someone who has earned the right to say it through months of personal experience? There was no counter. There was no reframe. There was just me, sitting in my own kitchen, having the structural integrity of my self-image tested by my 13-year-old son over a bowl of cereal. And here is where I am not proud of myself. Because instead of staying in that discomfort and letting it do what it needed to do, I deflected. I brought up his room. The homework I'd had to chase him about last month. The attitude he'd had on a particular Saturday morning that had nothing to do with anything we were currently discussing. I didn't do it consciously. I didn't think I am now going to redirect this conversation to protect my ego. But that is exactly what I did. I scattered the focus. I muddied the water. I introduced enough noise into the conversation that the clean, clear thing he had just said got buried under a pile of unrelated grievances. And I watched his face change when I did it. Not to anger. To something quieter and more defeating than anger. Recognition. Like he had been half expecting this and was now watching the prediction come true in real time. He pushed his chair back from the table, picked up his bowl, put it in the sink, and said, "It's fine, Mom, forget it," and walked toward the hallway. And I let him go, which was the biggest mistake of the entire evening. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after he left the room, long enough for the cereal bowl in the sink to stop being something I could pretend not to see. Long enough for the defensiveness to start losing its grip, and for something rawer and less comfortable to take its place underneath. Because defensiveness is exhausting to maintain when there's nobody left in the room to defend yourself against. When it's just you and the silence and the specific quality of quiet that follows a conversation that ended badly, the stories you were telling yourself 30 seconds ago start sounding a lot less convincing. And the one I had been telling myself most persistently, that I was present, that I was trying, that I was doing enough, had started to develop holes I couldn't patch with good intentions alone. I need to tell you something I haven't told many people. And I'm telling you now because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters most, the part underneath the TV and the cereal and the argument, the thing that was really driving all of it. For about 18 months before that Tuesday evening, I had been struggling. Not in a dramatic, visible way. Not in a way that anyone looking at my life from the outside would have been able to point to and name. But quietly, consistently, in the way that doesn't announce itself loudly enough for anyone to notice unless they're looking very closely. I had been tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Flat in a way that weekends didn't lift. Going through the motions of a life that looked fine from every external angle, while feeling increasingly disconnected from the inside of it. And the television had become my management strategy. That's the honest version. Not relaxation. Not downtime. Management. A way of keeping the noise inside my own head at a volume I could tolerate. When the show was on, I didn't have to think about the things I'd been avoiding thinking about. I didn't have to sit with the restlessness or the low hum of dissatisfaction I hadn't yet found the language for. I could just watch other people's manufactured chaos and feel, by comparison, temporarily stable. It was numbing. Deliberately, intentionally numbing. And I had dressed it up as self-care so thoroughly that I had started believing the costume. What my son had walked in and switched off wasn't a television program. It was 18 months of avoidance with a screen in front of it. And the reason his words hit as hard as they did, the reason I had reacted with that flash of defensiveness instead of the openness I'd promised myself I would bring into that kitchen, was because somewhere underneath the irritation I knew he had reached past the symptom and accidentally pressed on the source. He didn't know that. He was 13. He was reacting to what he could see, which was his mother disappearing into a screen every evening. He had no framework for what was sitting behind it. But I did. And I had been hoping, apparently, that nobody would ever get close enough to make me look at it directly. Here's what I understood sitting alone at that table. The TV hadn't created my disconnection. It had just been the most convenient place to put it. A container for everything I hadn't dealt with, hadn't processed, hadn't been willing to drag into the light and examine properly. And my son, without knowing any of the context, without having access to any of the interior story, had looked at the container and said enough. He didn't know he was saying it about everything else too. But he was. And I knew it. And the fact that I knew it and had still deflected upstairs when he tried to talk to me was the thing I was going to have the hardest time forgiving myself for. I got up from that table, turned off the kitchen light, and stood at the bottom of the stairs looking up at the thin line of light under his bedroom door. I had two options. Walk up those stairs or walk away from them. And I had already walked away from enough. I went upstairs. I want to tell you I knocked on his door and we had the conversation right then and there, and everything cracked open beautifully in the way it does in films where the music swells at exactly the right moment. But that's not what happened. I knocked. He said he was tired. And I stood on the other side of that door for a moment, hand still raised, and then I said goodnight and walked to my own room. Because sometimes the right move and the available move are two completely different things. And forcing a conversation through a closed door with a 13-year-old who has just watched his mother deflect everything he tried to say is not the right move. Some things need a night to breathe before they can be approached properly. I knew that. I was banking on it. What I hadn't banked on was what the night would do to me once I was alone inside it. I got into bed at 9:30, which I never do, because sitting downstairs felt impossible, and there was nowhere else in the house to put myself. I turned the lamp off, lay there in the dark, and my brain, freed from the task of managing a conversation or constructing a defense, went somewhere I hadn't given it permission to go in a very long time. It went back. Not to that evening specifically, further back than that. Back through the last 18 months in a way I hadn't allowed myself to do while I was living inside them. I thought about the version of myself from 2 years ago, before the tiredness had settled in so permanently that I stopped noticing it. Before the evenings on the sofa had become less of a choice and more of a gravitational pull, I stopped resisting. That version of me had plans. Not grand ones. Just the ordinary textured plans of a woman who was engaged with her own life. Things she wanted to do, conversations she wanted to have, a presence she wanted to maintain in her own home that felt intentional rather than accidental. And at some point, quietly and without any single identifiable moment of decision, she had started shrinking, pulling inward, letting the days blur into each other because engaging with their individual edges had started feeling like more than she could manage. I hadn't told anyone that. Not a friend, not a family member, not a doctor. I had managed it privately with all the tools available to someone who is determined not to make their struggle visible. Productivity in the hours where visibility mattered. Withdrawal in the hours where it didn't. And television. Lots and lots of television. And I had called the whole arrangement coping. When what I had actually built, I understood now, lying in the dark at 9:30 on a Tuesday, was a very convincing performance of coping that had fooled everyone including me. The clock on my phone said 11:40. Then midnight. Then 2:10. I had been lying there for hours without sleeping, which should have felt restless but actually felt necessary. Like my mind was doing something it had been trying to do for a long time, and had finally been given the conditions to do it in. Processing. Not comfortably. Not in a way that felt redemptive or clarifying in the moment. Just the slow, unglamorous work of looking at things you've been keeping in your peripheral vision, and letting them move to the center long enough to actually see them. I thought about his face when I deflected. That quiet recognition. The way he had said, "It's fine, Mom, forget it." Not like someone who believed it was fine, but like someone who had just confirmed something they'd been uncertain about and wished they hadn't. I had done that. In the one moment where he had taken a risk and stayed open despite every reason not to, I had given him a reason to close back up. And the responsibility of that sat on my chest in the dark in a way that no amount of rearranging could make comfortable. By 3 in the morning, I had stopped trying to sleep and started trying to figure out what I was actually going to say to him in the morning. Not to explain myself. Not to reopen the argument or relitigate who said what and whether it was fair, but to actually say something true. Something that didn't protect me at the expense of him. Something that acknowledged what he had been carrying, and what it had cost him to finally put it down in front of me. I didn't have the words yet, but for the first time in 18 months I was genuinely looking for them. And when morning came, so did something I hadn't been expecting. He knocked on my door first. He knocked at 7:15. I know because I had been watching the clock since 6, rehearsing and discarding opening lines the way you do when you know something important is coming and every version of it feels either too much or not enough. The knock was soft, uncertain in a way that his voice in the kitchen last night hadn't been. And that small difference told me something significant, that the composure from yesterday had cost him something too. That he had spent his own night on the other side of that wall doing his own version of what I had been doing on mine. I said come in and he opened the door and stood in the doorway in his school uniform, bag already on, 10 minutes before he needed to leave, which meant he had built this into his morning deliberately. He had set his alarm early for this conversation. That undid me a little before he'd even said a word. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and he said, "I didn't mean to make you feel bad last night. And I want you to understand what it took for me not to grab that immediately and use it as an exit ramp. Because that sentence was an off switch for the whole difficult thing if I wanted it to be. I could have said it's okay, we're fine, go have a good day, and we would have both walked away from it and never gone back. The surface would have repaired itself. The underneath would have stayed exactly as it was. And I had spent enough of the last 18 months choosing the surface over the underneath to know exactly where that road went. So instead I told him to come and sit down. And I told him I had been awake most of the night. Not to make him feel guilty, I was careful about that, careful about the weight I was placing on the sentence before I handed it to him. But because he deserved to know that what he had said had landed. That it hadn't bounced off me the way he'd perhaps feared it had when I deflected. That somewhere underneath the defensiveness, every word had gone exactly where he'd aimed it. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me with those careful eyes, and I took a breath and I did the thing I had been building towards since 2:10 in the morning. I told him the truth. Not all of it. Not the full 18 months of interior whether I had been navigating alone. That was more than a 13-year-old needed to carry and more than one morning could hold. But the honest, essential core of it. I told him that I had been struggling for a while, that the evenings on the sofa weren't really about the show, that I had been using it to avoid sitting with things I hadn't figured out how to deal with yet, that it had been easier to disappear into it than to be present in a way that might require something from me I wasn't sure I had. And I told him that none of that was his fault and none of it was his problem to solve, and the fact that he had been quietly absorbing the effects of it without complaint was something I was going to spend a long time thinking about. He was quiet for a moment after that. Not the closed, retreating quiet from last night. A different kind. The kind that means someone is actually taking something and rather than just waiting for their turn to respond. And then he said something that I have turned over in my mind every single day since that morning. He said, "I just missed you, Mom." Not the TV version of you. The actual you. And he said it so simply, so without drama or manipulation, that it arrived with a clarity nothing else in the conversation had. He hadn't been angry at me. He hadn't been judging me or building a case or trying to score a point. He had just missed his mother. And he had finally found a way to say it. I pulled him into a hug and he let me, which at 13 is not a guaranteed outcome, and I held on longer than I normally would and he didn't pull away. And in that small, ordinary moment something shifted between us that I don't have a precise word for. Not a resolution exactly. Not a fixing of everything that had accumulated. But a reopening. A mutual agreement, without it being spoken aloud, that honesty was allowed in this house. That difficult things could be said and survived. That the space between us was safe enough to put real things into. But there was still one conversation left that I had been putting off. And this one wasn't with him. He left for school and the house went quiet in a completely different way than it had the evening before. Yesterday's quiet had been loaded. Accusatory almost. The kind of silence that presses against you from all sides and dares you to sit inside it comfortably. This quiet was different. Emptier. Cleaner. Like something that had been blocked had finally been allowed to move. And the space it left behind was still getting used to itself. I stood at the kitchen window watching him disappear down the street with his bag on his back, and I stayed there long after he'd turned the corner, because I knew what was waiting for me when I stopped watching the empty street and turned back to face the inside of my own life. I made tea, actually drank it this time, standing at the counter rather than carrying it to the sofa to go cold beside a screen, and I let the morning sit around me without filling it. No television, no phone scrolling. No podcast playing in the background to keep my thoughts company so they wouldn't have to keep mine. Just me and the kitchen and the particular quality of a Wednesday morning with nowhere to hide in it. And the conversation I had been needing to have with myself since long before that Tuesday evening finally had the conditions it needed to actually happen. Here's what I admitted. Not to my son, not to anyone else, but to myself, standing in my kitchen at 8:30 on a Wednesday morning with a cup of tea that was still warm. I had not been coping. I had been performing coping. And the gap between those two things had been growing for 18 months while I decorated the outside of my life carefully enough that nobody, including me, had been required to look at the inside too closely. The tiredness was real. The disconnection was real. The flat, gray, going through the motions quality of my days was real. And I had been treating all of it as a personal failing to be managed quietly rather than a signal to be listened to and responded to honestly. There is something uniquely exhausting about maintaining a version of yourself that doesn't match what's actually happening inside you. It takes energy you don't advertise spending because the whole point is that nobody notices the expenditure. And I had been spending it every single day. At work, where I was functional and reliable and fine. With friends, where I was present enough to pass for present. And at home, where the effort finally ran out every evening, and I gave what was left of myself to a television screen because it was the only audience that didn't require anything back from me. I thought about what my son had said. The TV version of you. That phrase had been sitting at the back of my mind since the moment he said it, and now I let it come forward properly. Because he had identified something with that sentence that I hadn't been able to articulate to myself despite 18 months of living inside it. There were two versions of me operating in that house. The one who showed up occasionally, present, engaged, the mother I recognized from the story I told myself, and the one who showed up most evenings, going through the motions, unreachable behind a screen. And my son had been receiving mostly the second version while waiting patiently, and then not so patiently, for more of the first. I couldn't fix 18 months in a morning. I knew that. I wasn't standing in that kitchen expecting a revelation to reorganize everything neatly before lunch. But I was standing there willing to stop pretending, willing to put down the performance of fine and pick up something more honest in its place, willing to acknowledge that I needed something more than willpower and a better evening routine, that what had been building quietly inside me for a year and a half had outgrown my ability to manage it alone, and had started spilling into the life of a child who deserved better than to inherit the overflow of his mother's unaddressed struggles. I picked up my phone, not to scroll, not to put something on in the background. I opened my contacts, found my doctor's number, and booked an appointment for the following week. Took 4 minutes. It was the most important 4 minutes I had spent in 18 months. I didn't tell my son what I'd done that morning. Not yet. But that evening, for the first time in as long as either of us could remember, I was sitting at the kitchen table when he got home. He walked through the front door at 3:30 and stopped. Just for a second, just a small hesitation in his step, but I caught it. Because the thing that had stopped him was me. Sitting at the kitchen table, facing the hallway, with nothing in my hands and nowhere else to be. No screen. No show. No managed disappearance into the background of my own home. Just his mother, present and upright and oriented toward the door he always came through, the way mothers in his life had apparently not been reliably enough for it to feel normal to him. And the fact that my simply sitting at a table could register as something worth pausing over told me more about how much ground we had to recover than anything either of us had said in the last 24 hours. He said all right and dropped his bag by the stairs the way he always did. And I said, how was your day? And he said all right again. And on the surface it was the most ordinary exchange in the world. But underneath it something was different. The air between us had a different quality. Less careful. Less managed. Like two people who had said difficult things to each other and come out the other side still standing, which changes the atmosphere of a relationship in ways that are hard to describe but impossible to miss once you felt them. We were talking across a table that had always been there but had rarely been used for actual talking. And we were both aware of it without either of us pointing at it. I made dinner. A proper one, which sounds like a small thing and is a small thing except that it wasn't, not that evening, not given everything the previous 24 hours had contained. He sat at the counter while I cooked and told me about his day in the fragmented, nonlinear way teenagers relay information, bouncing between a thing that happened at lunch and a teacher who said something funny and a friend who was being weird about something he couldn't fully explain. And I listened. Not strategically. Not with one ear while the other half of my attention lived somewhere else. I just listened and responded and asked follow-up questions that came naturally because I was actually tracking what he was saying rather than waiting for my turn to move the conversation along. At some point during dinner he asked me if I was okay. Just like that, fork in hand, completely casually, the way you ask someone something when you already half know the answer but want to give them the opening to confirm it. And I told him the truth in the way you tell a 13-year-old the truth, honestly but without the full weight of it, enough to be real without making him responsible for carrying it. I told him I had been a bit lost lately and that I was working on finding my way back, that I had made an appointment to talk to someone about it, that it wasn't anything he needed to worry about, but that I wanted him to know because he had earned the honesty and pretending everything was magically fixed overnight would have been an insult to how perceptive he clearly was. He nodded, went back to his food, and then after a moment said good. Just that single word. Good. And somehow that small, quiet, utterly undramatic response contained more relief than a longer reaction would have. Because it meant he had heard me. It meant it was enough. It meant that what he had needed from me, underneath the TV and the cereal and the words he had finally said out loud, wasn't a perfect mother or a fixed mother or a mother who had everything handled. It was just a mother who was willing to be honest about where she actually was. We didn't fix everything that week. Or that month. Healing the kind of gradual distance that builds between people when one of them has been quietly absent for a long time is not a single conversation job. It's 100 small conversations. 100 small choices to show up instead of disappear. 100 evenings of sitting at a table instead of sinking into a sofa. It's the work of being present practiced repeatedly until it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like just the way things are. And there were evenings when I slipped. When the pull of old habits was louder than my intentions and I found myself halfway through an episode before I'd consciously decided to put anything on. What was different now was that I noticed. And noticing, it turns out, is where everything begins. My son taught me that on a Tuesday evening when he walked up to a television screen and pressed a button. He didn't know he was doing any of this. He was just a 13-year-old boy who had reached his limit and said so. But in doing that one small, brave, deliberate thing, he cracked open a conversation that I had been having with myself in the background for 18 months without ever quite managing to bring it to the surface. He didn't fix me. That was never his job. But he reminded me that being seen is only frightening until it happens. And that the people who love you enough to tell you a hard truth are not the ones to be defended against. They're the ones to be listened to. And if someone in your life has been trying to tell you something you haven't been ready to hear, maybe today is the day you let them.